prison sounds like a dreadful place. I don't know why anyone goes. Although the most notorious prisons no longer exist, they were shut down when the polar god gave us human rights. Today we look at some of history's most feared prisons, from Devil's Island to the Black Hole of Calcutta. The American Civil War saw numerous prison camps constructed to hold captured soldiers. They are remembered for being brutal, with tens of thousands dying in captivity. But by far the most notorious was Camp Sumter. It was a Confederate camp known for overcrowding. Sumter was built for 10,000 captives, but actually held 45,000. It was more of a concentration camp than anything else, with prisoners arriving by train and being herded into stockades. Prisoners built their own shelter within the camp as others died around them. 13,000 died here, mostly from exhaustion and neglect. Observers wrote about a time when 100 corpses were removed from the camp daily. Some of them were murdered by other prisoners. Gangs were formed within the camp to rob food from others. With gang wars breaking out from within the camp, overcrowding and a lack of supplies, some tried to escape. This led to the guards establishing a death line, a boundary that whoever crosses was shot dead. Camp Sumter was essentially a colony, being considered the 5th largest city in Confederate America. Local women were on occasion allowed to gawk at the starving captives in their makeshift city. When the camp was liberated, it was difficult to distinguish between corpses and survivors who were barely alive. The campgrounds are today said to be haunted by the ghosts of prisoners who took their own lives. Devil's Island was a famous prison colony of the French Empire. For 100 years, it was one of the world's most feared places. A small island just off the coast of South America, the journey there alone was notorious. Prisoners were stripped of their identity and given a number instead of a name. They were then shipped to the island in small cages like animals. On arriving, shackles were placed on their legs. They would work, sleep, and be disciplined in shackles. Many attempted to escape, but when caught would be locked in overcrowded rooms and likely die before their punishment even began. Prisoners were put to work by day, with even injured prisoners being forced to work in the jungle. They would regularly be beaten or locked in solitary confinement for at least 6 months. Many sent to Devil's Island soon lost their minds. But with shark-infested waters surrounding the island, escape was almost impossible. References in fiction made Devil's Island notorious as a colony of the damned. It was closed in 1953. When I say the Black Hole of Calcutta, you might think I'm talking about the Allahabad National Bank. I'm not, but let's take a moment to celebrate. That's the first Indian financial sector joke I've made. Definitely not the last though. In the mid-18th century, the East India Company was more powerful than some countries. In Calcutta, they built a fort to protect their interest, but the local Indian ruler besieged the fort. Those inside were thrown into a small dungeon known as the Black Hole of Calcutta. Survivors' accounts tell of around 150 captives, locked in a dungeon so small they could barely close the door. It wasn't long before most died of suffocation. They were locked inside for one night, but the next morning just 21 were still alive. In the Count of Monte Cristo, Edmond Dantes is sent to a remote prison known as Inescapable. Well, that prison once existed in reality on a small French island. A fort was built on the island in the 1500s, but as it was never actually needed for defensive purposes, was transformed into a prison. For 3 centuries, it was feared as a place where people were locked away until death. No one ever escaped from the prison. Those who got past the thick castle walls were drowned by the current. In the American Revolution, captured rebels were kept in various places. Many were kept in prison ships. Such ships would be stripped and filled with prisoners. Overcrowding and neglect gave notoriety to prison ships. The most notorious was the HMS Jersey. Those kept on board knew it simply as hell. As guards were known to sell prisoner rations for their own financial gain, captives would often die of starvation. What food they did get was worm-infested and rancid. Between 6 and 14 prisoners died per day on board. 1,000 were kept on board at any one time, and the ship's total death toll was 11,000. That's about 3 times as many Americans who died in battle. The Tower of London. To me, all of London is terrifying, but if I were a 17th century renegado, the Tower of London would be especially scary. It wasn't built as a prison, but over many centuries it held treacherous nobles, foreign spies, and gangsters. It was notorious as a place people were kept before being beheaded, and on occasion disappeared. Richard III had his 2 nephews locked in the tower. They were never seen publicly again. The remains of 2 children were later found in the tower. It's thought Richard had them killed to stop their possible claim to the throne. The tower's last execution happened in 1941. It was a Nazi spy found with forged documents and a German sausage. Also in London is Newgate Prison. At one time it was said that passers-by could smell the stench of suffering from within the prison. In 750, 11 men were tasked with washing the prison walls. 7 of them contracted diseases, but the inside of the prison was far more disturbing. It was built specifically for London's most dangerous criminals, serial killers, highwaymen, and assassins. Many of them were held here in the lead up to their execution, and so locals saw the prison as a gateway to hell. It was so infested with bedbugs and cockroaches that the floor would crunch underneath visitors. The guards were known to torture and beat inmates unless their relatives paid them for protection. Newgate was home to so much violence and corruption that prisoners often died before their trial. All this made Newgate Victorian England's most notorious prison. The Bastille was so notorious that France has a national holiday to celebrate its destruction. It was a fortress guarding the gates of Paris. Over time, the imposing structure was transformed into a prison. Only a small number of people were held in the Bastille, but it was known by locals as a place of torture and isolation. The cells were tiny and dark. Prisoners would be lowered into them by rope, with the only entrance above them. Noble families would sometimes conspire to have their enemies secretly taken to the Bastille and never released. Many rumors describe locals disappearing at night and secretly being held there forever. The man in the iron mask was not a fictional character. For 34 years he was locked away and his identity hidden by an iron mask. It's unknown what his identity was, but we do know he was held in the Bastille, as was Voltaire twice. The British Empire made good use of penal colonies. They were remote prisons, usually in distant corners of the empire. Those sent to penal colonies would often be put to hard labor, thereby helping the empire expand. But in reality, much of their labor served no purpose outside of punishment, and the colonies came to be feared as little more than slave camps. Tasmania was an especially feared location for prisoners shipped abroad, and Tasmania's most notorious colony was Mercury Harbor. The prison opened in 1822, and for 11 years convicts were kept here in brutal conditions. The island was overcrowded and known for scurvy as prisoners were seldom given enough food. In fact, it was so overcrowded inmates were made to sleep standing up. One prisoner stabbed another inmate to death, hoping to be executed for it, as he would rather die than remain in the colony. With floggings a common punishment and bone-breaking hard work, many tried to escape. Alexander Pierce once escaped with 7 others. Wandering into the Tasmanian wilderness, they were soon starving. Members of the team either gave up or died until there were just Pierce and 1 other. It's believed Pierce killed and cannibalized the other man to survive, but he was later recaptured and executed. Mongolia seems like it's always been a brutal place. In 1920, the Western world got a chilling insight into life for Mongolian prisoners. In the country's capital, serious criminals were confined to small boxes. The boxes were essentially coffins, usually kept in dark dungeons. The type of place insanity doesn't take long to set in. Apart from being sparsely given food through a hole in their boxes, prisoners were largely neglected. Many died from exhaustion in the summer, and in the winter from hypothermia without authorities caring. The practice was finally outlawed in 1920.